Morning I found the pill bottles hidden behind a spare towels in the guest bathroom. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me more than anything. I'd spent 63 years learning how to stay calm in the worst moments. But this was different. This wasn't a bad moment. This was something much colder than that. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand where I was when it started. My daughter Lily. I know, I said I wouldn't use names from the list. Let me start again. My daughter's name is Brianne. She's 31 years old, and she has my mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, which is a combination that has made her both the best and most exhausting person in my life. 3 years ago, Brianne was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune liver condition, the kind that doesn't get better on its own, the kind that has a waiting list measured in years, not months. I'm a retired school teacher from Savannah, Georgia. I taught 4th grade for 27 years. I know how to stretch a dollar, and I know how to be patient, and I know how to love somebody through something hard. What I did not know how to do was watch my daughter turn yellow in a hospital bed, while insurance companies sent me letters that said not medically necessary and claim denied. Her husband, Brianne's husband, his name is Cassidy, but everyone calls him Cass. He's a good man. The kind of good that's quiet and consistent, not flashy. He worked 2 jobs during those first 18 months. He sold his truck. He sold the fishing boat his grandfather left him, and still it wasn't enough. I sold the house I'd lived in for 30 years. Still not enough. We were looking at a specialist in Houston, a doctor named Dr. Ewing, who had a treatment protocol that wasn't yet covered by any standard insurance plan. Experimental, they called it. I called it her only shot. The cost was something I couldn't say out loud without feeling like the floor was dropping out from under me. That's the situation I was in when I met Harlan. I wasn't looking to meet anyone. I wasn't at a mixer or a church social or one of those apps my neighbor keeps telling me about. I was at a hospital waiting room in Augusta, sitting in one of those chairs that were clearly designed by someone who has never had to sit in one for 6 hours. My back hurt, and I hadn't eaten since morning, and I was trying to read a form that kept asking me questions I didn't know the answers to. The man next to me leaned over and said, "That's the billing dispute form. You need a different one." I looked up. He was older than me by about a decade, I guessed. Silver-haired, neatly dressed, the kind of posture that comes from old money or military service. He pointed to the desk near the window and said, "Third stack from the left." I got the right form. He helped me understand 2 of the questions. We didn't talk much after that, just the kind of small, polite exchanges you have in places where everyone is carrying something heavy. When I stood up to leave, he said, "I hope things go well for your family." I thanked him and walked out and didn't expect to see him again. 3 weeks later, I ran into him at the pharmacy on Broad Street. He recognized me before I recognized him. He was picking up what looked like several prescriptions, a white paper bag with the staple at the top that means multiple items. He smiled and asked how things were going. I told him the truth. Not all of it, but enough. He told me his name was Harlan Beaumont. He said he owned a couple of properties around Augusta, had some family business interests he was wrapping up. He said it simply without showing off, the way people talk about work when they've been doing it long enough that it's just part of their routine. He asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime. I said yes because I was lonely and he had been kind, and at 63 years old, you stopped waiting for the right time to accept a small kindness. We met at a diner near the hospital 3 days later. He told me he'd been diagnosed with a degenerative heart condition 14 months ago, that the doctors had given him somewhere around 8 to 10 months from that point, though he said it with a calm that made me wonder if he'd had a long time to make peace with it, or if the calm was just his way. He was 74 years old. He had been married once for 31 years to a woman named May, who had passed away 6 years prior. He had a stepson from May's first marriage, a man named Dwayne, and a stepdaughter named Vicky. I asked him why he was telling me all this so soon. He said, "Because I'm not interested in wasting either of our time." That was the moment I started to trust him. Over the next few weeks we talked more. He was sharp and funny in a dry way I hadn't expected. He had opinions about everything: baseball, local politics, the correct way to make biscuits, and he stated them all with the same quiet certainty. He asked about Brianne. He asked about Cass. He asked about the treatment in Houston and the numbers involved, and he listened without the careful face people put on when they're waiting for you to stop talking about something uncomfortable. I did not ask him for anything, I want to be clear about that. He was the one who brought it up. About 6 weeks after the diner, sitting on his porch on a Tuesday evening, he said, "I've been thinking about your daughter's situation." He paused. He looked out at the yard. "And I've been thinking about mine." He said that what he owned, the properties, the accounts, the various business interests he'd spent his life building, was going to pass to his estate, which his stepson Dwayne was already positioning to control. He said Dwayne had never worked a day in Harlan's business, that he was interested in one thing, and it was the same thing people like Dwayne were always interested in. "May built half of what I have," he said. "The idea of Dwayne squandering it keeps me up at night." He looked at me then. "I have a proposal," he said, "and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." What he proposed was a marriage, legal, formal, real on paper and in the eyes of the law. He said he'd pay for Brianne's treatment in full and set up a fund to cover ongoing care. In exchange, I would move in, manage the household, and act as his wife for whatever time he had left. When he was gone, I would inherit a portion of his estate, enough to keep Brianne comfortable for the rest of her life. I sat there for a long time. I thought about Brianne's face in that hospital bed. I thought about Cass selling the fishing boat. I thought about the third stack from the left, and this man who had noticed which form I needed when I was too tired to figure it out myself. "I need a week," I said. He said, "Take 2. I took 10 days. I talked to Brianne, who cried and told me not to do it, and then cried again and told me she couldn't ask me not to. I talked to my sister Margene in Tallahassee, who told me I had lost my mind. I talked to a lawyer just to understand what I was agreeing to. And then I said yes." We were married at the courthouse on a Wednesday morning in October. Brianne stood next to me and Cass stood next to her, and Harlan's longtime attorney, a man named Mr. Breck, was the only witness from his side. Dwayne and Vicky were not invited. Harlan had made a point of that. I moved into the Beaumont house 2 days later. It was a large house on the east side of Augusta, old colonial style, well maintained in the bones, but dusty in the way houses get when someone has been living in them alone for a long time. I cleaned, I cooked, I set up the medications on the kitchen counter in the order they were supposed to be taken. I drove Harlan to his appointments on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It was strange at first, then it became something else, a kind of steady, quiet companionship that I hadn't known I missed. I met Dwayne for the first time about 3 weeks after I moved in. He came by on a Sunday afternoon without calling ahead. He was in his late 40s, a wide man with a flat smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked at me the way people look at something that wasn't there the last time they checked. "You must be the new arrangement," he said. Harlan, from his chair in the living room, said, "She's my wife. You'll speak to her accordingly." Dwayne smiled again, that same flat smile. "Of course." Vicky I met the following weekend. She was more practiced at politeness than her brother, the kind of politeness that's really just hostility wearing a nice coat. She brought flowers. She asked me questions about myself with a warmth so carefully manufactured that it made my teeth hurt. When she left, she hugged Harlan and whispered something in his ear that made his jaw tighten. That night I asked him what she'd said. He waved it off. "Nothing you need to worry about." I should have pushed. I didn't. The first thing I noticed that felt wrong was about 6 weeks in. Harlan had a Tuesday appointment with his cardiologist, Dr. Peabody, and when Dr. Kahn, Peabody, came out to speak with me in the hall, he said that Harlan's most recent blood work was showing some elevated liver enzymes that they hadn't seen before. He said it was likely just a medication interaction, and they were adjusting the dosage accordingly. I nodded. I thanked him. In the car on the way home, I asked Harlan if he was taking anything besides what Dr. Peabody had prescribed. He thought for a moment. "Vicky brought me some supplements a while back. Herbal things. She said they'd help with the fatigue." "Do you still have them?" He said they were in the cabinet in his bathroom. That evening, I looked them up while he was resting. The label was printed on a small white sticker, the kind you can make at home, not a commercial product. The ingredients listed included several herbs I didn't recognize. One of them, when I searched the name, came back with a note that it could cause liver stress in high concentrations. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I told myself it was probably nothing. That I was reading into things because I was nervous and new to this situation and already on edge about everything. I put the bottles in a bag and set the bag on the top shelf of the pantry, behind the good serving plates. I told Harlan the supplements might be interfering with his prescriptions and asked him not to take them anymore. He agreed easily, which told me he'd never been that attached to them. 3 days later, the bottles were back in his bathroom cabinet. I knew I hadn't put them there. Harlan said he hadn't moved them either. That was the day I stopped telling myself I was probably overreacting. I didn't confront Dwayne or Vicky. That's the decision I'm proudest of, looking back, because every part of me wanted to walk into one of their Sunday visits and lay it all out on the table. I'm a school teacher. I was trained to address problems directly, but I'd also spent 27 years watching children lie to my face with absolute confidence, and I knew that the moment you show someone you suspect them, you lose the advantage. So I kept quiet. I started keeping notes, dates, times, what I observed, what Harlan reported feeling. I took the supplement bottles, both of them, and drove to a lab testing facility I'd found online. One that doesn't require a doctor's order. I paid out of pocket. I asked them to identify every compound in both bottles. Then I called Mr. Breck. I'd met the attorney only once at the wedding, but Harlan had mentioned him several times as someone he trusted completely. I asked Harlan if he'd mind if I reached out to Mr. Breck with some questions about the estate paperwork, framing it as me wanting to understand my own legal situation better. Harlan said of course. My conversation with Mr. Breck lasted about 45 minutes. I told him everything. I showed him the photos I'd taken of the bottles. I read him from my notebook. He was very quiet while I talked. At the end he said, "You were right not to confront them." He said he'd been watching Dwayne with some concern for a while now, and had been waiting for something concrete. He said, "Give me a few days." In those few days, things happened faster than I expected. The lab results came back. One of the compounds in the supplements was in fact a botanical extract known to cause cumulative liver and kidney stress in elderly patients, particularly those on cardiac medications. It wasn't immediately dangerous at low doses, but sustained use could cause organ strain that would look on paper like natural deterioration. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the lab and read that report 3 times. Then I drove home and made dinner and did not say a word. Mr. Breck contacted a medical consultant who confirmed the lab findings and their implications. He also, quietly, contacted an attorney who specialized in elder financial abuse, and then, because he had been Harlan's attorney for 22 years and knew things I didn't, he pulled the original estate documents and compared them to a version Dwayne had recently submitted for review, claiming Harlan had asked for modifications. The signatures on the modified documents, according to a forensic document examiner Mr. Breck engaged, did not match Harlan's known signature samples. On a Thursday afternoon in February, 4 months after our courthouse wedding, Harlan's doctor called Dwayne and Vicky to the house for what he described as a family health update meeting. Mr. Breck was already there when they arrived. So were 2 officers from the Augusta Police Department. I stood at the top of the stairs and watched Dwayne's face when he walked into the living room and saw who was waiting for him. His flat smile didn't appear this time. Vicky looked at me, just for a moment, then she looked away. They were both arrested that afternoon on charges related to the fraudulent estate documents and, based on the lab report and medical testimony, on suspicion of intentional harm through the administration of a harmful substance. Dwayne's attorney later tried to argue the supplements were given out of care and the signature discrepancies were clerical errors. That argument didn't hold up well once the forensic examiner testified. Harlan's cardiac condition, as it turned out, had been somewhat overstated in severity. Not fabricated, but the latest specialists believed that with correct medication management and without the additional strain of the botanical compounds, his prognosis was measurably better than the original 14 months. Not cured, not even close, but more time, more good time. That's the part that stayed with me. More good time. Brianne had her procedure in Houston in March. Dr. Ewing said the results were as strong as they could have hoped for. She called me afterward from the recovery room and she was still groggy from the anesthesia and she said, "Mom, I think it worked," and I had to leave the room so Cass wouldn't see me cry. I'm not going to pretend that what Harlan and I have is a love story in the way people usually mean. We didn't fall for each other in the dramatic way that songs are written about. What happened was something quieter and, I think, more durable. I made him tea in the evenings and he told me about May and I told him about my 32 years in that house in Savannah. and we watched the news with the volume too loud, because he wouldn't admit his hearing wasn't what it used to be. He trusted me with his life, literally, and I treated that trust like it was the most important thing I'd ever been handed, because it was. I moved into their house as an arrangement. I stayed as something I don't have a clean word for, not quite wife in the traditional sense, not caretaker, not friend exactly, though friend is the closest, someone who chose, every single day, to show up. The thing about doing the right thing is that it rarely announces itself as the right thing while you're doing it. When I drove to that lab with 2 supplement bottles and a paper bag in the passenger seat, I didn't feel brave. I felt scared and tired and deeply uncertain that I'd read the situation correctly. I kept thinking about what I'd lose if I was wrong, what Harlan might think of me, what Dwayne might do. But I kept going anyway. And on the days when I'm tempted to think it was luck that things turned out the way they did, the timing, the lab, Mr. Breck, all of it, I remind myself that none of it happened by accident. It happened because I paid attention, because I kept notes, because I didn't give them a reason to cover their tracks before the evidence was solid. The third stack from the left, that's still what I think about. A stranger in a waiting room who noticed which form I needed. Sometimes that's how it starts, one small kindness that doesn't know yet what it's planting. Harlan is still here, we still have dinner every evening, he still has opinions about everything, and states them with the same quiet certainty, and I've stopped arguing with him about baseball because he's usually right. My daughter is alive and getting stronger, and last month she called me to say she might be pregnant, and she was laughing while she said it, and so was I. I spent 63 years learning how to stay calm in the worst moments. What I didn't know until now is that the same steadiness that gets you through the worst moments is exactly what gets you to the good ones. I keep coming back to the moment I sat in that parking lot with the lab report on my lap. Nobody was watching. Nobody would have known if I'd folded it up, put it in my glove compartment, and told myself it wasn't my problem to solve. I was 63 years old. I was tired. I had already done the hard thing by saying yes to a life I hadn't planned for. But here's what I've come to understand: the consequences of what we do, and what we choose not to do, have a way of arriving exactly on schedule, whether we're paying attention or not. Dwayne had been making choices for years. Small ones at first, probably. A little resentment here, a little entitlement there. Then bigger ones. And each choice made the next one easier, until he was standing in a living room being read his rights and still wearing that flat smile like he hadn't quite registered what was happening. The path he ended up on wasn't an accident, it was accumulated. And my path wasn't an accident either. What I did in those weeks, the notes, the lab, the call to Mr. Breck, wasn't brave in any dramatic sense, it was just careful. It was paying attention when it would have been easier to look away, and thinking clearly when I was scared, and doing the next right thing even when I wasn't sure it would matter. I was a school teacher for 27 years. I know that the difference between the child who figures something out and one who doesn't usually isn't talent. It's whether they're willing to stay with the problem long enough to see it clearly. That's what I did. I stayed with it. Harlan trusted me. That trust wasn't something I asked for or expected, and it wasn't something I took lightly. There's a kind of moral weight that comes with being trusted by someone who has very little reason to trust anyone. And I think most of us know, somewhere underneath the noise of daily life, when we're holding something that matters, and when we're letting it down. I wasn't willing to let it down. Not because of what I stood to gain, but because he was a decent man who had spent his life building something real, and he deserved someone in his corner. My daughter Brienne is getting stronger. Harlan is still here. And I am still, on most evenings, making tea and listening to a man who has opinions about everything and states them with a certainty I've stopped trying to argue with. None of this happened because the universe arranged it to work out. It happened because I noticed which form I needed, and then later I noticed which bottles didn't belong, and then I decided that noticing wasn't enough, that doing something with what I knew was the only thing that would let me sleep at night. The third stack from the left, a small thing, but that's where it started, and I think that's the whole lesson, if there is one. Show up, pay attention, and when the moment comes, and it will come, have the courage to act on what you know is right, even when you're standing in a parking lot alone with a lab report and a whole lot of uncertainty. That's not heroism. That's just character, and character, it turns out, is the only thing that actually holds.